Imagine all the things you could do in 5 years. In just 5 years, a child can go from infant to being enrolled in kindergarten. And in less than 5 years, if you work hard at it, you can obtain a bachelor's degree. A lot of Americans, if they work hard enough, could probably pay off most of their credit card debt in a period of 5 years. And the point I'm getting at here is that there is an awful lot that can happen. A lot can change in 5 years. And so as we're kind of thinking about the kinds of things that can be done in 5 years, it's been about 5 years since one of the greatest aviation mysteries of all time came to pass. And there is still no resolution. Some people have claimed that they have solved this case. I can assure you there is no conclusive solution to this one, not yet. And after 5 years, it seems like just yesterday that MH370 disappeared. But in those last 5 years, probably several lifetimes worth of cumulative study and search and investigation have ensued, trying to find out what happened to that plane. Now think about this. People go missing every year, every single year. If you actually go and look at crime statistics provided by the FBI and other agencies, people go missing every year. And I've actually looked at these numbers. The majority of people who go missing are younger people, usually under the age of 20. They're runaways, people who leave home for various reasons. And in truth, it's a surprisingly small number of people who are considered missing persons whose disappearance can be attributed to some kind of foul play. So what do you do when more than 230 people just vanish off the face of the earth? And add to that the idea that some of the evidence might suggest that foul play was involved. And all these things, the fact that there was so much effort put behind it, so much money spent, so little in the way of answers to show for it, all these things make the disappearance of Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 one of the greatest mysteries of all time. And after 5 years, it's just been announced that Malaysia may in fact be willing to restart the search for that missing plane. Now, previously they had said if there was compelling evidence to support reopening that search, they would do so. But on the 4th of March of this year, Time magazine reported, and this being one of the most recent updates in this ongoing investigation, they report here, a Malaysian official said, just last Sunday, quote, "The country is more than willing to restart the search for the vanished MH370 plane should any company, they say, again, present a fresh plan to track down the aircraft." Now, apparently this renewed interest comes as families of the deceased passengers, most of whom live in China, mark the 5th anniversary since that flight disappeared, along with all of its passengers. And so here we are, 5 years. So many questions and so few answers. Now, of course, what we do know, in addition to the fact that the plane went missing along with 239 people on board, is that it was en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing. There were some pieces of debris that were recovered, most notably on Reunion Island, and that, of course, a flaperon that some believe belonged to the aircraft. And despite this debris washing up and seemingly belonging to the plane, that should give researchers, you would think, a very good idea about where this plane went down. And looking at these components that were found, what few that were actually recovered, I mean, everything from which side of these pieces of wreckage the barnacles had grown was taken into consideration, as far as how long it might have been adrift, what parts of the ocean it might have been in, what kinds of currents might have brought them to a place like Reunion Island, and thereby where most likely the rest of that aircraft would turn up. And yet it's still missing. Shipwreckages have been found, all kinds of things have been learned in terms of the bathyspheric information about the ocean floor, but we still haven't found that plane. And a few people wonder if it actually ever went down in the ocean. Is there any place else that it could be? And so really, to try and make any progress with this, we have to start from the very beginning. And that was at approximately 10:50 p.m. local time, or 14:50 UTC. Captain Zahari Ahmad Shah signs in for duty that night. And for my own part, I had taken interest in wanting to know, was there anything in particular going on that night when Captain Shah signs in for duty? Now, what we do know, of course, are some of the aspects of his personal life that have raised questions. A failing marriage, a flight simulator in his home, where he seems to have charted a path across ocean waters, but I get ahead of myself. He signs in for duty that night. 25 minutes later, the first officer on duty that night, Farik Abdul Hamid, signs in for duty as well. Now, on a technical side note, we have to talk for a moment here about what's called a satellite data unit, and in avionics terms, that is, things having to do with electronic equipment on board aircraft. This is a device that allows air-ground communication via satellite networks, okay? And this is a significant point in the discussion because it was at 12 p.m. local time, precisely, that the aircraft's SDU logs onto the Inmarsat satellite communication network. It is now online. And 27 minutes later, air traffic control operators give the captain and the first officer clearance to push back from the gate, and the aircraft takes off at 12:41 a.m. And at that moment, the Boeing 777-200ER takes off from Kuala Lumpur and is headed off on what is expected to be an uneventful nighttime flight to Beijing. All tracking systems are identified as being fully functional on board that craft. Now, I'll refer to a CNN timeline here that reports that half an hour later, one of the plane's communication systems sends what turns out to be its last transmission. And this information taken directly from a statement by the CEO of Malaysia Airlines. Malaysia's Ministry of Transport further commented that, quote, it showed nothing unusual. The 1:07 a.m. transmission showed a normal routing all the way to Beijing. Now, another technical footnote to all of this that plays into this story significantly involves the aircraft communications addressing and reporting system. And that essentially is a computer on board that aircraft that collects information about the aircraft and the pilot and their performance. And in fact, most vehicles with computers on board, most vehicles, including cars that you and I drive, it's pretty common to have systems that monitor things like oil levels and engine performance, right? And so that's what the aircraft communications addressing and reporting system on board that aircraft is doing. And apparently the computers were measuring thousands of data points and sending that information via satellite back to the airline, as well as the engine manufacturer. So a lot of information was being recorded and reported back to various agencies about the performance and operations of this plane. And due in part to this, everything is going exceptionally smoothly, and then the official good night occurs 22 minutes later, making it 1:19 a.m. at that time. Now, the final words issued from the cockpit in a note received via a voice check-in with ATC operators was someone saying, all right, good night. And you've got to keep in mind that this is not just someone actually saying good night. This is sort of radio parlance, as it's been called. Pilots use this expression, good night, when they are leaving one airspace and entering another, where they will then be communicating with other ATC operators in a different district or airspace. And so these were the final words issued from the cockpit back to ATC. All right, good night. And that again just being a sort of verbal cue, okay, exiting your airspace, be seeing ya. And so nothing seemed at all up until this point like it was out of order, which made it all the more strange 2 minutes later when the aircraft's transponder stopped communicating. And that happens precisely at 1:21 a.m. Now, needless to say, this is not a normal thing for aircraft to do. If an aircraft is flying without a transponder, that generally means only one of two things: that the aircraft's transponder is malfunctioning, which is very unusual, or perhaps even more unusual, the notion that the aircraft and its pilots, for whatever reason, intentionally turned it off. Now, that can be done. Again, all you have to do is flip a switch from the cockpit and the transponder can be turned off. But again, that is extremely unlikely, and according to Richard Quest, who is an aviation expert and a consultant on these kinds of issues to CNN, essentially once you turn that transponder off, the plane is flying blind, at least from the ground's point of view. He further says if there's a radar there, the radar will see a blip, but they won't know who it is or where they're going. They will just know that there's something there. Now, the air traffic controller, of course, would notice something like this, but at that time, there was something else being noticed by air traffic controllers and military radar in Thailand, because just 1 minute after the transponder goes offline at 1:22 a.m., a Thai radar station in southern Saranthai province does pick up what it describes as an unknown craft. They can't identify it. And furthermore, this aircraft appears to be heading in the exact opposite direction that MH370 and its flight course had indicated, and this confirmed by spokespeople with the Royal Thai Air Force. Now, between 1:21, when that transponder goes offline, and the following 7 minutes, the plane, presumably MH370, being tracked, unidentifiable by Thai military radar, appears to have changed course. But at least according to current data, there is no indication of when that flight plan would have changed and when the course of the aircraft would have been modified. Again, keep in mind that the ACARS system on board that aircraft, as recently as it had reported back to ATC in Malaysia, had a clear flight plan set for Beijing. And by 1:30 a.m., Malaysian air traffic controllers in Subang, outside of Kuala Lumpur, have lost contact completely with the plane, as it was passing over the Gulf of Thailand between Malaysia and Vietnam. So another 7 minutes pass. Obviously, ATC operators, military radar operators, they realize there's something going on. Something is well out of the ordinary. Now, that aircraft communications addressing and reporting system, or the ACARS system that we mentioned, every half hour or so, there is a transmission from that system on board that aircraft that is expected. And so by the time 1:37 a.m. arrives, air traffic control operators are expecting that next transmission, and it never comes. And so as a technical point, what we definitely know from that is that between 1:07 a.m. local time and 1:37 a.m., at some point in between those two timestamps, the ACARS system stopped communicating. Now, with a transponder, you can flip a switch and turn that off. The ACARS is a very different situation. That's not going to be the kind of thing that you just flip a switch and take it offline. But at this point, we know that at some point prior to 1:37 a.m., that ACARS system was taken offline, and that requires a bit of technical knowledge in order to do. Richard Quest, again commenting, suggested that if the flight were hijacked or a target of terrorism, cutting off the ACARS would be a strategic move, because the system reports to satellites anything being done to aircraft. And what the evidence seems to show is that that ACARS system went offline before the aircraft was no longer being seen on radar. So presumably someone on board that aircraft probably had to have known how to disable that system. We fast forward now to 2:15 a.m. At this point, obviously, neither the ACARS system or the transponder are communicating any information back to ground, but radar does still detect that there's a plane in the air. Now, there was a Malaysian Air Force official who noted that military radar tracked that plane as it passed over the small island of Puala Perak in the Strait of Malacca. It's hundreds of miles off course. It's on the other side of the Malay Peninsula at this point. And that military radar that's tracking the plane as it's passing hundreds of miles off course at this point shows that it was flying generally in a westerly direction back over the Malay Peninsula. And you can only imagine what's going through the minds of military officials who are watching this plane, monitoring this aircraft with no transponder. There's no ACARS system, no information being reported. Presumably, although this is all happening in the course of just minutes, keep in mind, it's very possible that enough information was getting around between military and civilian ATC operators. Perhaps they realized at this point, hey, we've lost MH370, and there's an unidentified aircraft. It could only be the same plane, but it's hundreds of miles off course to the west over the completely opposite side of the Malay Peninsula. And this was the last time that military or civilian radar operators were able to track that aircraft, because after this, the plane just vanishes. But at this point in the story, the search begins, and the most likely explanation at this time is that the plane had gone down somewhere in the southern Indian Ocean. And so U.S. and British officials are getting involved. The Malaysian military had been keeping data on the plane, and they provide this to the two aforementioned countries who are getting involved. They set aside all their concerns about any kind of sensitive military intelligence at this point, which was a big deal according to those in the know in the aviation industry, because they said, you've got to keep in mind that the Malaysian military would just hand this information over to the British and the U.S. I mean, let's read between the lines right here. They put their own national security at risk in some ways in doing that. And so the impetus driving that would had to have been the concern that there may have been an incident that required international response and attention. And you can imagine what kind of incident would require that kind of thing. Yeah, in fact, many were concerned that there was some sort of a terrorist operation at play right here. And Richard Quest, again, who comes up into this a lot, being the expert that he is, they don't want anyone, he said, to know how good their radar is, or presumably how bad, right? He said, quote, they obviously decided that that didn't matter at this point when they handed that information over to the United States and Britain. And again, keep in mind, it's coming up on 2:40 a.m. We're still within hours of when that plane took off. Not even 3 hours have passed. Remember at the beginning, we talked about all the things you could do in 5 years. Now consider all of the things, all the events that have transpired in under 3 hours since that plane took off. At 2:40 a.m., Malaysian air traffic controllers announced to Malaysia Airlines that Flight 370 is missing from radar according to the airline. And over the course of the next hour, the airline, quote, sources every communication possible to Flight 370 to try and locate its whereabouts before declaring that it had lost contact with that aircraft. During this period of uncertainty, according to a spokesperson, it was said that Malaysia Airlines needed to establish facts by contacting other air traffic controllers and aircraft flying within the same route. Now, 3:45, exactly an hour and 5 minutes after at least what we would call the preliminary search has begun, Malaysia Airlines issues a code red alert that the plane is missing from radar, which of course, as we know as we're outlining all these details, is something they were already well aware of, but they had to be absolutely certain, and they had to try and follow up on every lead that they had, which included handing over raw data to the U.S. and Britain, who are already on the scene looking into this. The search ensues, and finally the code red is issued at 3:45 a.m. That is, to be specific, when it declares that a crisis has occurred, which requires immediate deployment of emergency response plans. And the reason they say that it took about an hour to issue that code red alert is simply because they were trying to locate the plane. They needed to make absolutely certain that it was indeed missing. And in order to verify that, they said that various measures were implemented, including sending messages to the plane and awaiting a response, none of which they received. So a code red alert is issued by Malaysia Airlines, and then another 3 hours passes. Dawn is now rising over Beijing, where the plane is now supposed to be arriving. It's 6:30 a.m. In another hour, Malaysia Airlines will announce on Facebook publicly for the first time that the plane has disappeared. And as you can imagine, this is the nightmare scenario. We have lost one of our planes, and we have to say something about this publicly. Now, it had been hours since radar or any other system had tracked this aircraft. And based on the instrumental data, we have a pretty clear idea of when these systems were taken offline, which makes it all the more interesting that at 8:11 a.m., the announcement has been made, the code red has been issued, and yet there is indeed information that comes forth at 8:11 a.m. that a satellite has tracked that plane, and this now more than 7 hours after it took off. Now, satellites, when they're tracking aircraft, and keep in mind that one of the very first things that happens in the course of events that occurs on this evening is that at 12 a.m., the SDU system on board that aircraft logs into the Inmarsat satellite communications network. And so what occurs from time to time are what are called handshakes, okay? Electronic connections with a plane below the area where the satellite is that are also tracking this aircraft as it passes. A satellite handshake occurs at 8:11 a.m. Now, they say it's likely that the plane didn't complete that handshake because its communication systems, again, were already disabled, but nonetheless, the satellites would have been able, they say, to trace a plane flying below them, and according to a statement from the Malaysian Prime Minister, the raw satellite data, he says, confirms that the plane that was pinged via that handshake, that electronic connection that occurred at 8:11 a.m., was MH370. And based on analysis of that raw satellite data, the Malaysian Prime Minister and the Malaysian government aren't the only ones who concur. They say that, in fact, the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board, the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration, and also Britain's Air Accidents Investigation Branch all say that they believe that that is indeed the case, that that electronic connection, that satellite handshake occurred at 8:11 a.m. with MH370. But that satellite information isn't actually publicly disclosed for several days. In fact, even the radar data wasn't acknowledged right off the bat. But around this time, you can imagine there's panic ensuing. The families of those who had been on board the flight have now been notified, and it is public knowledge that the plane has gone missing. Meanwhile, 2 people among those who were listed as passengers on the manifest, one from the country of Austria, the other from Italy, are found not to be on the flight. Furthermore, they say both men's passports were reportedly stolen in Thailand within the last 2 years. This raises a number of concerns, and immediately the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board dispatches a team of investigators which are sent to Malaysia to assist in this investigation. Around the same time, Inmarsat also hands over its satellite communications data with Flight 370 in compliance with the company that provided the data link for the communication systems and equipment on board Flight 370. Now, the following day, March 9th, there are 40 aircraft and more than 24 sailing vessels from different nations that are involved in the search for MH370. And the focus of the search at this time centers on the Andaman Sea at the request of the Malaysian government. The Chief General of the Royal Malaysian Air Force announces that Malaysia is focused at this time on a recording of radar, and there is, they say, the possibility at that time that they believed Flight 370 had turned around and traveled over the Andaman Sea. Keep in mind that when Thai military radar tracked the plane, it appeared the unknown plane that they tracked was heading in the completely opposite direction of the flight path expected for MH370. So at this point, Malaysia Airlines decides to dispatch a team. There are more than 150 senior managers and caregivers that are sent to Beijing. And you can probably imagine why caregivers are being sent to Beijing. Of course, there's a center being set up there where families of those on board who had been awaiting their loved ones are being comforted and awaiting the latest news from the airline. And you can only imagine how this is going on. I mean, Malaysia Airlines, they have lost a plane. They have people, family members in Beijing. Everyone is scared to death. They are offering comfort. They are sending people, caregivers. They are offering free transportation to Kuala Lumpur. They're doing literally everything that they can during this code red situation, but really we all know it was worse than that. And arguably that would have to be one of the most awful things as a family member that you would have to go through. Now, meanwhile, Interpol at this point is able to confirm that the 2 individuals who were supposed to be on the plane and were not, the Austrian man and the Italian man, they confirmed that the passports of these individuals were registered in its database of stolen passports. But apparently there was no query of the database made at that time. And on that date, March 9th, The Guardian reports with the following headline: Italian's passport used to board flight MH370 was stolen in Phuket, and refers to hundreds of passports that are believed to be lost or stolen every year in a black market racket on this tourist island. Reading from the article here, they report the Italian national, who was believed to be on flight MH370, has told Thai police that his passport went missing last year from a motorbike rental shop on the tourist island, where hundreds of passports are thought to be lost or stolen every year in a black market racket. This man was identified as Luigi Maraldi, a 37-year-old man who was on holiday during the summer in that country when he said he left his passport at an undisclosed rental shop in Patong, and apparently discovered later when he went to collect it that the shop owner had handed it over to a man who they said, quote, looked similar, or so they said. And the Guardian went on to say that basically passports are often held if you rent a car or a motorbike in that country, but they said that the island is a hotbed of identity theft and complaints of lost or stolen passports are rife. Now, the following day, Time magazine reports about Flight MH370's 2 mystery passengers. This report again from March 10th, and they say a pair of male passengers boarded the flight with passports stolen in Thailand from European visitors. One of the passports had been stolen from Austrian Christian Kozel in 2012. The other, which we already know, was from Luigi Maraldi from Italy. Each unidentified passenger, they said, bought a one-way ticket for the flight last Thursday in a shopping mall in the Thai resort town of Pattaya. They said that their tickets called for them to continue on to Amsterdam before splitting up to travel to their final destinations in Copenhagen and Frankfurt. Now, there was a lot of speculation, as you can imagine, at this time. Some of the other points that were raised on March 10th, 2014, in Time magazine. They said migrants and drug smugglers sometimes use stolen passports in this part of the world, according to aviation officials. And they said on Monday afternoon, a Malaysian aviation official said reviews of surveillance videos suggested the pair had non-Asian features and that one resembled Italian soccer star Mario Balotelli. It was further stated by another unnamed Malaysian official that one of the two men had been identified, but they had declined to name them. They further said that Malaysian aviation officials did not run the passports through Interpol's stolen and lost travel documents database before the flight. The database would have alerted Malaysian officials that the pair was attempting to board the flight with passports that had been reported stolen, and hence that database query referenced earlier that had not been made. We return again now to The Guardian. The following day, it's now March 11th, 2014, and they report Iranians traveling on flight MH370 on forged passports were not linked to terror. So the two men now identified as Poria Noor Mohammed and Syed Mohammed Rezar Delawar were not believed to have been linked in any way to terror. The Guardian reporting the international police organization Interpol has released an image of the two men. They say the more information we get, the more we are inclined to include it was not a terrorist incident. Now, stepping away from the narrative here for a moment, this was an aspect of the entire story that seemed so entirely strange. An Italian man and an Austrian man. They each have their passports stolen, which are subsequently used by two Iranian men to board MH370. And with little doubt by now, if there were some kind of known link to terrorism, we would probably know about that. But that entire situation seemed to be very strange. Here is what The Guardian reported. As early as March 11th of 2014, they reported that Noor Mohammed had been using a stolen Austrian passport in an attempt to reach Germany to seek asylum and reunite with his mother. This according to Malaysian police. His mother, it was later confirmed, was waiting for him in Frankfurt. Delawar was apparently using a stolen Italian passport. They said visa requirements have been eased in recent years for Iranian nationals traveling to Malaysia, making the country a popular hub for Iranian tourists, students, and those looking for ways to emigrate to Europe. Keep in mind, Noor Mohammed was only 19 years old, and Delawar was 29, a little older. Now, according to an unnamed Iranian, quoted in The Guardian, who said that they'd met both of the passengers in Malaysia and actually went with them to the airport, this individual was interviewed by the BBC's Persian service about the days before their departure, and this is what the individual said. One of the two was my friend from high school. I met him the first day he arrived in Malaysia. He said he was staying for 3 to 4 days, but was eventually going to Germany. His final destination was Frankfurt. So all this information seems to have been confirmed. In fact, there were even posts on Facebook made by Noor Mohammed that showed him in Kuala Lumpur, where he wrote, quote, feeling excited. These were the two men with the stolen passports who presumably went down on that plane. Meanwhile, on the same day, there is now a system engaged in an effort to try and aggregate satellite data to help find the plane. This launched by China, who activates what's called the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters. Almost directly coinciding with this, Inmarsat also provides Malaysia with an initial analysis of the communications with Flight 370, and they discussed the information with U.S. investigators, and all parties apparently agree to allow the U.S. to investigate that Inmarsat data. As we know, shortly after 8 a.m. that morning, there was reportedly satellite data, a handshake, that was attempted. But on March 11th, New Scientist is the first to publish an article reporting that Flight 370 had sent, in fact, at least 2 bursts of technical data back before the aircraft completely disappeared. Well, over the course of the next 24 hours, little happens apart from information which we now already know being publicly made available, and there was even some misinformation. The Wall Street Journal and certain other publications who were reporting things like the idea that the ACARS system had actually been communicating data back to Rolls-Royce. This was later disputed, and although that was proven not to have been true, it did come out on March 14th, directly from Inmarsat. They publicly acknowledged that they had recorded transmissions, they said, from the aircraft for several hours after it disappeared from air traffic control over the South China Sea. Now, that doesn't mean that they necessarily were monitoring that craft, but merely that they had recorded transmissions that logged it for several hours after it actually went off the radar. So naturally, this information is disclosed publicly by the Malaysian Prime Minister the following day, who confirms that Inmarsat's satellite communication network had maintained contact with the plane for several hours after it was lost by ATC in Malaysia. Prime Minister Najib further stated during that press conference that the ACARS messaging system was disabled early in the flight, and confirms that of the satellite communications that were logged, the final one on record had been the one that was made at 8:11 that morning. They said that the final communication was made along one of two arcs. They said a northern corridor stretching from northern Thailand to Kazakhstan, and a southern corridor from Indonesia into the southern Indian Ocean. So following this, a series of diplomatic notes are dispatched by Malaysia to the countries along those two corridors. Meanwhile, it was on that date of March 15th that investigators also visit the homes of the two pilots of MH370. And at that time, they find the infamous flight simulator in the home of Captain Shaw. And this, of course, was big news at the time because of the implications, but the full details about that flight simulator, what the path indicated on that flight simulator, and what it might have indicated about Captain Shaw remained in part speculation, although it was confirmed by many media outlets as much as 2 years later, in August of 2016. In addition to the potentially tantalizing clue that was being offered by the discovery of the flight simulator in Captain Shaw's home, in late March, we also begin to see the first arrival of possible debris. And on March 20th, then Prime Minister of Australia, Tony Abbott, made an announcement that satellite imagery from March 16th appeared to show two large objects in the ocean. They appeared to be floating. They were about 2,500 kilometers southwest of Perth. And those images, taken by Digital Globe and analyzed by the Defense Imagery and Geospatial Organization, showed objects that appeared to be 24 meters and 5 meters in length, respectively. Now, again, what these objects were, whether they were indeed objects, remains in question. Aircraft were dispatched to the area to try and discern what the satellite images appeared to have shown. They didn't find anything. And this incident would mark the first of several false positives in the search for possible wreckage. Again, 2 days later, on March 22nd, officials announced that images captured by a Chinese satellite, and this imagery dating to March 18th, reportedly showed a possible object, this one believed to have been 22.5 by 13 meters in size, and also 3,170 kilometers west of Perth. But still, despite combing the area, search teams find no evidence of actual debris based on what the satellite images may or may not have visualized. 2 more days pass, and on March 24th, Malaysia's Prime Minister Najib Razak announces at a press conference that MH370 had most likely gone down in the southern Indian Ocean. He also believed at this point that they could say there were no survivors. Shortly before this announcement, Malaysia Airlines also notifies families and says that it is, quote, beyond reasonable doubt, unquote, that there are no survivors. Meanwhile, in lieu of this announcement by Malaysia's Prime Minister, the search area is then narrowed to the southern part of the Indian Ocean to the west and southwest of Australia. And during this period of the search, the area that is being combed is significantly narrowed. In fact, the entire northern search corridor, which basically comprised areas northwest of Malaysia and also the waters between Indonesia and Australia, were ruled out and removed from the search area. Australian search aircraft reportedly at this time spotted a large orange rectangular object as well as a gray or green circular object, this again southwest of Perth, further confirming the idea in the minds of searchers that this was the most likely area that the object had gone down. And these weren't the only objects reportedly seen. On the 26th of March, officials announced that there were images this time captured by a French satellite, and they appeared to show up to 122 floating objects. And this area of objects was believed to have comprised a region of about 23 meters in length, and these just a little north of the previous satellite observations that brought up, again, what might be called false positives, only because subsequent search of these areas didn't turn up anything conclusively. The following day, it's also announced that a Thai satellite, this time on March 24th, appeared to have photographed a region that comprised of 300 possible objects, yet again southwest of Perth and about 200 kilometers south of the French observations previously. And in addition to all the satellite imagery that was coming forth at this time from different nations reporting that they thought they had found possible debris fields, we also had a Chinese patrol ship, Haixun 1. And beginning on April 4th, it makes the first of a few possible ULB detections. Now, on a brief technical note, ULB refers to Underwater Locator Beacon, and I'll refer briefly to a technical article about this entitled Underwater Locator Beacon Signal Propagation on Tropical Waters from July of 2017, in which it states, at the instant the aircraft flight data recorder or the ship voyage data recorder comes in contact with water, a locating device called the ULB starts a continuous emission of acoustic signals or pings for a minimum period of 30 days. After the crash of the Air France 447 in 2009, a discussion began about the effectiveness of the pingers in assisting in the location of black boxes and whether they should undergo some kind of modification to improve its capabilities. And so needless to say, it's significant that a ULB ping might have been detected. And then the following day on April 5th, the Haixun 1 made another possible ULB detection, and this time occurring about 3 kilometers west of the previous day's detection. And it should be noted neither of these were apparently recorded. They were, however, nonetheless noted, since we're discussing them here, and then they were reported thereafter. Meanwhile, another vessel involved in the search, the HMS Echo, was sent to the location along with a submarine tasked to try and search the area where these possible ULB detections were made in early April. However, neither of those vessels were able to confirm those ULB detections. They say it was determined the depth of the seafloor, surface noise, and the equipment used on board the Chinese vessel Haixun 1 probably made it unlikely that those detections were indeed from ULBs. But significantly, the following day, April 6th, marked 30 days since Flight 370 had presumably gone down there in the southern Indian Ocean. And that's significant here in the discussion of those ULB pings because the minimum battery life of the ULBs on board Flight 370 had been precisely that, 30 days. And in a statement from the manufacturer, they had predicted that the maximum battery life would be about 40 days. And so this date of April 6th marked the beginning of the period during which they would expect that ULB's battery to expire, and they would no longer be able to track the ULBs if pings were even detectable. And so even though statements had been issued to the family members of those on board the plane by Malaysian authorities, and it was being widely discussed in the press that in likelihood there were no survivors, there is still a mounting sense of urgency. And at this point, searchers are beginning to realize that any day, the very technologies that they would hope would help them locate the craft may begin to fail. And they have very little time in terms of hopes of actually locating the aircraft, if it's even still in one piece. So on April 8th, the ADV Ocean Shield makes 2 possible ULB connections close to the same area where they had initially occurred 3 days earlier. These 2 possible pings last 5 minutes and 7 minutes respectively. And then on April 9th, it is announced that this acoustic search is going to continue for as long as feasible because they believe that the more and better quality detections that they are able to gain, the more likely they will be able to pinpoint the aircraft's location. And that is, of course, based entirely on the idea that those detections were indeed from Flight 370's ULBs. That's not confirmed, of course. As the search continues, it's reported on April 13th that an oil slick is found about 5.5 kilometers from the same general area where those possible ULB detections were made by the ADV Ocean Shield. Samples were gathered, and then on April 17th it was announced that the tests of those samples from the oil slick detected neither jet fuel nor hydraulic fluid or anything else you would expect to find in an oil slick. So we'll back up a couple of days here to April 14th. The ULBs have now been underwater for 38 days at this point. And despite the search that is combing this area with hopes of finding more of these pings, it's been almost a week and there have been no conclusive detections made. And so the ADV Ocean Shield stops searching and deploys a Bluefin 21, which is a torpedo-shaped autonomous underwater vehicle. And this little unmanned submarine is equipped with side-scan sonar so that it can scan the seafloor and look for further possible ULB detections. But at this point, again, MH370 has been underwater for 38 days. It may not even be possible, considering that battery life, for further ULBs to even be detectable. And partly because of that, an executive decision is made to begin to search the seafloor in the vicinity of where those detections occurred, but utilizing seafloor sonar. The Bluefin 21 is deployed with a programmed area to scan, and it starts conducting sonar scans of the ocean floor. Now, each one of these missions that the Bluefin 21 carries out is going to scan about 40 kilometers of the seafloor, and each one takes about a full day, 24 hours, to complete. And the reason it takes that long is because sending the UAV down to a depth where sonar can be conducted takes a full 2 hours, and you double that amount because it takes that same amount of time to bring it back up to the surface after it's spent 16 hours at that depth conducting that sonar array. And then there's the processing of the data, and so about a full 24-hour period is spent collecting the information each time this UAV goes down and conducts a sonar scan. And of course, don't forget the battery life. Battery life seems to be one of the key issues we face with all of these technologies, and being the owner of a drone myself, I know that I can get a good 15 minutes or so of battery life on a good day, and then it takes a while, maybe a couple of hours, to fully charge that battery. Whereas with this underwater drone, they're able to get that good 20 hours of battery life, and then it only takes 4 hours to charge it so that it can go back down again. But the first time they deploy it, it actually ends up having to come back up because the Bluefin 21 reaches its maximum operating depth, but it has to be in waters where it can be at least 50 meters above the seafloor to obtain a reliable image in the first place. And so the conditions there at that depth are impossible for it to operate, and they have to bring the thing back up again. Now, although official wreckage from MH370 won't appear until July, on the 23rd of April, a noteworthy incident occurs because a metal object that they describe as being a piece of riveted sheet metal washes up on the western coast of Australia. And this is the first time that there has been a sighting of an object that is actually recovered. But unfortunately, when the Australian Transportation Safety Board examines the object, they say that it's unrelated to Flight 370. And during the ensuing days, the surface search is actually concluded. And then there's a meeting between a number of nations that is held to discuss the next phase of the search and to try and see exactly how Australia, Malaysia, and also China want to proceed with this. So we skip ahead at this point to the end of May, and on the 28th, the seafloor sonar survey is completely done. They have 30 deployments, the Bluefin 21, which scans around 860 square kilometers of seabed, and there are no objects that are found. And you'd think that with detailed sonar scanning of the entire ocean floor, that kind of data would help you find a missing plane. Well, nothing turns up. And so to the dismay of the searchers, despite the promise of the possible acoustic signals detected earlier, they have to basically conclude that this area is probably not where the plane went down. There is absolutely no sign whatsoever of wreckage. Now, I mentioned that the first actual wreckage of MH370 doesn't begin to show up until July of the following year, in fact, and so we still have several more months of search ahead of us. However, there is something noteworthy that occurs at this stage in the search. And this was an incident that occurred on July 17th of that same year, which involved Malaysia Airlines Flight 17, which was shot down over a rebel-controlled area of Ukraine. But when the initial reports came out, a lot of people were like, wait, we've got another missing Malaysia aircraft? And this one, of course, confirmed to have been shot down. But the other weird, you might call it synchronicity here, is the timing. Because this happens on the anniversary of another famous plane crash, that of TWA Flight 800. And whether or not there was any kind of significance to the fact that MH17 goes down on that anniversary, it's notable nonetheless, as the search for another Malaysia plane is still underway. And of course, the Malaysian Defense Ministry assures everyone at this point that, hey, we're not going to be distracted by the fact that one of our planes was shot down, especially since we're still trying to find out what happened to MH370. Now, like I said earlier, apart from this little addenda about MH17, which again is not really related to the ongoing search for MH370, but many noted that it was peculiar that another plane would be lost under entirely different circumstances on that date while the search for MH370 is still underway. But we skip ahead now to October 8th, because on this date there is a peer-reviewed paper published by Inmarsat scientists who analyzed the communications that were known to have occurred on the night that Flight 370 went missing. And this paper, by the way, published by the Journal of Navigation, a publication of the Royal Institute of Navigation, but it details the methodology of the calculations that were made to determine the search area, and they basically conclude that due to the way that the information was handled, as the initial search effort was underway, it resulted in the shifting of search zones. And right around the time this report is actually being made public, scientific information is still being collected with regard to the search, including bathymetric data and things like this. But we skip ahead now to the early months of 2015, because at this stage, the search efforts actually end up being suspended temporarily due to the tropical storms and cyclones that are occurring in this part of the ocean. The first one hits on February 1st, that's Cyclone Eunice, and then another that occurred on March 17th, the ex-tropical cyclone Haliba. But on March 8th, in between these two events that cause suspension of the search, we have, of course, the passage of March 8th, that being the first anniversary of the disappearance of MH370. So we are 1 year in now, and Malaysia's Ministry of Transport releases an interim report coinciding with this date. This, of course, is required by international protocol, and that report focuses on all the information they have managed to collect at that point. And there's really only one significant element that had not been public knowledge prior to this that appears in this report, and that is the statement that the battery in the underwater locator beacon attached to the flight data recorder they believed had expired in December 2013, and that might have compromised its performance. So again, we're talking about the possible battery life of some of these elements on board the aircraft, and the battery on that locator beacon had expired in December 2013. That doesn't mean that it wouldn't have been operative, but it is less likely to have held that 40-day charge. It probably had died closer to the 30-day mark, if not sooner. And during this period, although there's nothing found of MH370, we do begin to find a number of shipwrecks, and there have been several located over the course of the search for MH370. But on May 13th, there's a high-resolution sonar scan, which reveals a number of small objects on the seabed, the largest of which was roughly rectangular on its longest side, about 20 feet in length. And subsequent photography indeed does reveal that this is a shipwreck, which probably sank while carrying a load of coal, and they identify the coal next to that. These images are sent to underwater archaeologists to try and identify what the actual wreck might have been. But like I said, it wasn't until July of 2015 that we begin to finally see debris associated with the actual MH370 crash. And I want to refer to a Britannica Online article. At this point, they report the first piece of debris was not found until July 29, 2015, when the right wing flaperon was discovered on a beach on the French island of Reunion, and this island located about 3,700 kilometers west of the Indian Ocean area that was being searched by Australian authorities. Over the next year and a half, 26 more pieces of debris were found on the shores of Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa, Madagascar, and Mauritius. Now, all of this wreckage did not apparently belong to MH370, but 3 of the 27 pieces were positively identified as having come from that flight. And even though that's only 3, that is significant. In addition to that, another 17 of the total 27 pieces of debris were thought to have likely come from the plane. And this is significant too because 2 pieces of debris that were found came from the cabin interior. And the implication here should be pretty obvious. That suggests, of course, that the plane would had to have broken up for portions of the interior to have been found among that wreckage. However, investigators weren't able to determine if that breakup happened in the air or on impact with the ocean. They say the study of the Reunion wing flaperon and a piece of the right wing flap found in Tanzania showed that the plane had not undergone a controlled descent. That is, they say the plane had not been guided to a water landing. The discovery of the debris was used to narrow the search area in the Indian Ocean, since some possible crash sites would have been unlikely to produce debris that would have drifted to Africa. Now, the discovery of the flaperon there on Reunion Island was probably the most significant discovery of all these. And you may remember that there was some back and forth about what had been found and whether it was verified. By early August, Malaysia was saying, hey, this absolutely belonged to a Boeing 777. We have the verification with investigators of France that has occurred, and they're saying the same thing. However, by August 6th, when Malaysia's Transport Ministry is saying that window panes and an aircraft seat cushion and all kinds of other things have also been found on Reunion, France is now disputing some of the claims, at very least saying that we haven't confirmed that what has been found conclusively belonged to MH370. And to show you just how specific this search got, someone found a packet of Malaysian noodles, and this in South Australia. Also in New South Wales, there was a Malaysia Airlines baggage tag that was found, and both of these items turned in to Australian authorities, who said of the two discoveries that, quote, "It's very challenging for investigators to find something that can be linked to the aircraft." They said it would really have to be some form of debris from the craft itself. Nonetheless, they said, "We encourage people to bring anything unusual or out of place forward. It's far better that we investigate and rule it out, even if it's just a baggage tag or a pack of Malaysian noodles, which could have really come from anywhere." Now, around this time, Malaysia's government also publishes a new theory through their news agency. They believe at this point that flight MH370 might have made a soft landing on water, and rather than crashing and sinking immediately, it might have actually floated for a while on the surface, but then sank mostly in one piece. Now, although many researchers endorsed this theory, one of the questions that arises about that is, why wouldn't there have been any further communication from MH370 and those on board if indeed a soft landing had occurred? That remains a questionable theory from my perspective. But on September 3rd, French investigators affirm with certainty, they say, that the flaperon, which again there had been some dispute about earlier, but they say that the flaperon from Reunion Island absolutely was from Flight 370, and this was determined because of a serial number that they actually found that matched the records of the Spanish manufacturer that produced portions of the flaperon in question. Furthermore, just 5 days later, there is a report that includes a drift analysis which was produced by Australia's Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, and they conclude that the discovery of that flaperon on Reunion was consistent with the current search area that they were combing for evidence of Flight 370. So quite obviously, that flaperon was the first indisputable piece of evidence which gave conclusive evidence, at least in part, about the possible fate of MH370 and the possible location of where the remains of that aircraft had been. But obviously it had broken apart, and this further evidenced by the other debris that's been recovered. But I refer now to a New Zealand Herald article from July of 2015, which tells the story of the beach cleaner who actually stumbled upon some of that wreckage. His name was Johnny Begway, and he'd been strolling along Reunion Island on a beach looking for pebble to grind up chilies, according to the story, when he suddenly discovered what he called a weird thing on shore. This weird thing, and they picture him in the article holding it, turned out to be part of a wing flap, as it was reported. They said it was half covered in sand and had barnacles encrusted on its edges. And this was significant to many of the researchers who had said that, well, for this particular kind of barnacle to appear on the wing flap, it would had to have been held aloft and floated in a certain position, and further would had to have remained in a particular region of the sea in order for the barnacles to be on that portion of the wing flap. I mean, they were really breaking this down to the best of their ability, as you would imagine they should, right? But coming back to Johnny's story, they say he and some colleagues dragged this presumed wing flap further inland to avoid it being swept back out to sea, and then after Googling plane disasters, that's how they made the connection with MH370. However, Johnny and his friends didn't have any idea that their discovery might draw the world's attention to their tiny little island home of Reunion, and may have just solved, and this again reported from 2015, one of aviation's greatest ever mysteries. This would be one of many instances where people would begin to use the S word, solved, and it was by no means the last time. Many since have claimed, although Johnny never made that claim, it was something that the press was saying. He may have solved the mystery. I can assure you the mystery remains, even though there have been many others who since that time have claimed to have solved it. But he said it was a really weird experience finding that piece of the aircraft. He said, "It gives me the shivers. The piece of luggage was here since yesterday, but nobody really paid attention." That's right, they'd also found a battered suitcase in the same place as the rest of the plane wreckage. Well, during the ensuing months, there are more reports, more analysis. In fact, even in December of 2015, another shipwreck, this one from the 19th century, is discovered. They can find shipwrecks missing for more than a century, and yet this plane remains missing. 2016 finally rolls into scope, and there are a few significant leads apart from the discovery of other 19th century shipwrecks. But on the 2nd of March, this is when the discovery of another one of those objects, this one from Mozambique, occurs, a suspected horizontal stabilizer, and this one found by an American tourist on a sandbar. By the 24th of the same month, Australian Transport Minister Darren Chester announces that two pieces of debris, which included that object reportedly discovered in March, as well as an object found in Mozambique by a South African tourist back in December of 2015, were both almost certainly from MH370. Incidentally, around this time, a piece of engine cowling also turns up on the coast of South Africa. Then on April 2nd, a piece of debris is suspected to have been part of what's called a bulkhead from inside the cabin of an aircraft. This wasn't conclusively associated with MH370 at the time, but the Malaysian transport minister would later say that this is almost without question from MH370. And then finally, in June of that year, the Australian transport minister, Darren Chester, once again said that a piece of aircraft debris found on, this time, Pemba Island off the coast of Tanzania had possibly been another wing piece from the missing plane. And despite all of these pieces that are emerging, by July of that year, there's a meeting. We have Australia, China, and Malaysia who are all involved with the search, and they basically agree on one thing, that they say if no credible evidence pointing to a particular location where the aircraft may be found can be brought forward, that the search would have to be suspended after the 120,000 square kilometer high-priority search was completely done. At this point, probably already one of the most costly in history, which it certainly is by today's standards. And with the search still underway but possibly nearing a close, scientists in July from the Euro-Mediterranean Center on Climate Change even published a paper analyzing where the wreckage had been found, and taking into consideration ocean drift, they predict a totally different crash site further north than where the Australian Transportation Safety Board had been searching. And at this point, as 2016 is coming to a close, even despite the recovery of so much wreckage that has been conclusively associated with the plane, with all the differing opinions about where it might have gone down, with no potential leads that conclusively give searchers an idea of the areas of the ocean they should be searching, with the coming of January 2017, the underwater search for the wreckage of Flight 370 is officially suspended after the complete survey of 120,000 square kilometers of the southern Indian Ocean, and ultimately a failure to recover the plane. By this time, $160 million was spent on the total search effort. So what actually did happen to MH370? Of course, we found pieces of wreckage out there in the ocean, which turned up on Reunion Island and other places, but that hasn't prevented speculation about what else might have happened, including theories that the aircraft crashed in the Cambodian jungle. And if you're like me, you might be wondering how wreckage from something that crashed in the Cambodian jungle ends up on Reunion Island. But this was nonetheless the opinion of independent aviation expert Daniel Boyer, and he's often been cited in the British tabloids for having opinions about what might have happened to the plane. He believed that using Google Maps, he found areas in the Cambodian jungle that he believed were the outer fuselage of MH370. And he was supposedly so certain that he had found the crash site that he actually sent an expedition to where he believed the plane was. Unfortunately, he says that the people he sent weren't able to reach the crash site because team members were at risk of dehydration or even death, but insists nonetheless that the people he sent out there spoke with locals who all described seeing the dragon-like logo on the side of the plane, which would have identified it as being one of the Malaysian aircraft. Now, how likely does that sound to you? Of course, there was also the theory that the plane had been shot down, and the reasoning behind this had been, if you'll remember, of course, on the night that the plane first goes offline, the transponder is flipped off. Something weird is going on, and in truth, that's all still really strange. Nothing about that does not sound suspicious. But if you recall, the Thai military were tracking the plane that night, and they had that unidentified aircraft that they were tracking via radar. And with military agencies tracking an unidentified aircraft, and with MH370 having turned off its transponder, many investigators were of the opinion that it would have been believed at that time that the aircraft had been hijacked and that there was a possible terrorism incident underway. And you don't take chances on a thing like that. And you'll remember even with 9/11, similar conspiracy theories had been made about whether or not one of the hijacked aircraft had been shot down because of the concern about it being flown into the Pentagon or even the White House. And so that had been a theory among proponents that the plane hadn't been taken down by Americans who valiantly rushed the cockpit, and there's ample evidence that suggested that that's exactly what happened, and that those people truly were heroes. But again, the conspiracy theorist attitude had been that, well, that just seems unlikely, and this is a great cover story that puts patriotism behind the real reason we took that plane down. We didn't want it to crash into the White House, and so a missile was sent up there. Well, similar lines of logic were applied to MH370. Had the plane been hijacked and they were going to try and fly that thing into some landmark we don't want to take any chances. What if it was shot down? And that was another theory. Although, on the nearer side of the plausible, many have suggested that it very well may be that the plane, after breaking apart, any large pieces of the wreckage that might yet be recovered simply have not been found because they're nowhere near the areas that have already been searched. And keep in mind, with all the different locations where wreckage did turn up, we should have a pretty good idea of where the remains of MH370 are likely to be found. But again, this also would have been the mentality of the searchers at the time that they were combing that huge area of the ocean to the tune of several millions of dollars. And they didn't find it either. But in likelihood, I do think that one thing we can with absolute certainty conclude is that the aircraft is no longer in one piece, and that evidenced by the fact that there have been different locations where different portions which have been conclusively attributed to that plane have turned up, and some of those pieces of debris also from the interior of the aircraft. And so that brings us up to the most recent developments. And back in May of last year, there had been a panel of experts that appeared on a 60 Minutes Australia program, and they claimed that they had come up with a most likely scenario as to what probably happened to MH370. The Telegraph in the UK reporting on this, and they wrote that aviation experts believe they may have solved the mystery of the disappearance of flight MH370, saying the 239 passengers and crew were the victims of a deliberate criminal act carried out by the plane's captain. And I'll note that after this report aired, the captain's daughter rebuts this and says, it's absolutely not true. This is horrible what you're saying about my father. And we have to be clear. There is some evidence that suggests that there may have been, let's not say evidence of a crime for now, let's just say premeditation in terms of planning a flight path, and that certain actions that are consistent with what we know about the flight path of MH370 before it disappeared are consistent with things that the captain might have planned. That comes back to the flight simulator. And there are other things about Captain Shaw that are, you might say, questionable. He had reportedly sent what are described as creepy messages to models and things like this. All kinds of things have been said about this man, which some have tried to use to insinuate determinate factors about his behavior or other things that might help discern if indeed he was involved with what happened to that plane. It's hard to imagine that he wasn't, especially keeping in mind that the transponder could be turned off from the inside of the cabin of that aircraft. It seems that one of the two individuals in that cockpit, therefore, had to have done that, and the most likely one being the man who was in charge of the control of that aircraft, Captain Shaw. But according to this panel, the Telegraph reports, they said, assembled for Australian television program 60 Minutes, they say the evidence suggests Captain Zahiri Ahmad Shah executed a careful series of maneuvers to evade detection and ensure the plane disappeared in a remote location. So remote, in fact, that the plane still hasn't been found. And in fact, one of the most recent developments has been a report that suggests that indeed the pilot may have been involved, although a third party can't be ruled out even at this point. But they say that, again, manual control of the aircraft seems to have been taken from within the cockpit. And among the many questions that still remain about what happened to MH370, why the plane ended up thousands of miles off course, who switched the transponder off, preventing anyone from tracking the aircraft, and why had there never been a Mayday message or even a final phone call from anyone who had been on board the plane? If the passengers on board had suspected something was wrong, shouldn't they have been contacting loved ones, sending text messages, and other things along these lines? It seems that there is only one thing for certain that authorities can agree on, that at the time that MH370 went missing, someone on board that plane was in control of what was happening and made a conscious decision to steer that plane to its ultimate fate, whatever that may have been. And I think it's kind of remarkable how many questions remain about what might have happened to that plane. I mean, 5 years has gone by, some wreckage recovered, and as we've heard, there are still so many questions, but to me, one of the most unusual things about the entire situation, apart from the fact that there was obviously someone in control, and that the intentions based on the activities observed, particularly flipping off that transponder, and the technical knowledge that would have been needed to turn off the ACARS system, these kinds of things point to the fact that not only had there been someone in control and acting with intention, but they also had to have a degree of technical capability in order to carry this out. Now, if you add to that the fact that there had been no emergency calls or text messages from people on board the plane, perhaps it's possible that they were in an area where they might not have had cell phone service and therefore had tried to communicate but simply were unable to. But this led to another theory that hypoxia might have been involved, where the aircraft might have ascended to an unsafe altitude and that people on board might have actually lost consciousness due to lack of oxygen. That theory, while speculative and one that was actually offered fairly early while the search effort was underway, is nonetheless one that is worthy of considering. Because again, if where the plane was located on its course there had been attempts to make emergency calls, it's very unusual that none were attempted. Although it does lead to another question. Could it be possible that since this was a nighttime flight, the passengers on board the aircraft might not have known that anything was out of the ordinary? Often on larger aircraft, and I know this from flying pretty frequently myself, there are screens where you can watch movies and things right there that are embedded on the back seat of the seat in front of you, so that you as the passenger can not only watch entertainment while you're flying, but also so that you can have access to information about where on your route you actually are, which is kind of neat. I've done that myself when flying, especially if you're on a transatlantic flight. To be able to see where you are in the world at any given time is kind of neat. So I don't know if Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 had that kind of equipment on board its aircraft with that kind of information available to its passengers, although it stands to reason that, again, what might have occurred is that the pilot had, for whatever reason, turned that system off. Keep in mind the transponder and the ACARS system were off as well. Who knows, it might have been as simple as saying, hey, sorry guys, our system is down, we won't have any entertainment available for the duration of this flight. And people are mumbling and grumbling, but they start reading books and playing with their phones instead, as people do on aircraft. They may not have even been aware of what was happening until it was just minutes or moments before the plane finally went into the water. Again, a lot of questions remain, but after 5 years and millions of dollars funneled into the search effort, the fact that that plane remains missing is not only a mystery of aviation, but truly one of the great mysteries of modern times. And with any luck, perhaps future search efforts will finally give us a clue as to what may have happened, because if the fuselage can be recovered, and if they can obtain other parts of the aircraft, namely the black box, we may still be able to glean an idea of what happened with new data forthcoming at a later time. But as it currently stands, and after 5 years, that is the complete story of MH370, which remains missing. And it goes without saying, after 5 years and still so many questions, my heart goes out to those who lost loved ones when this plane went missing, and I, like so many others, hope that there will be an eventual resolution. I also hope you have enjoyed this presentation on this very timely subject, and of course, if you want to learn more about my work, you can go to my website, micahhanks.com, where you can find podcasts, blogs, videos, and other work that I do. You can also support my work through donations. I featured a portion of this audio on the Middle Theory podcast, and if you go to middletheory.com, there is a button on the right-hand side of the page where you can make a PayPal donation in any amount that you choose. All offerings are accepted and much appreciated. And above all else, thank you so much for taking time to listen.